They called her the ugliest bride in England, and half of London came to St. Cecilia's church, only to watch a duke's son suffer for money. None of them knew that before the night was over, the bridegroom would be on his knees in front of her, staring at scars her own father had put there. St. Cecilia's church had never been so full, and never so cruel. Every pew in Greystone Parish was packed shoulder to shoulder with silk and jewels, and not one soul among them had come to wish the bride well. They had come to see a spectacle. They had come to watch a duke's daughter walk toward a man who was, by every account whispered in London's drawing rooms, paid a fortune to pretend he did not see her face. Lady Adelaide Harrington stood at the back of the church, 27 years old, tall enough to look most gentlemen in the eye, built solid and strong rather than slender and fashionable, with a dark reddish-purple birthmark spreading across the left side of her face and down into her throat. Small, clustered growths marked the skin beneath it. Her hairline had drawn back at the temples until no arrangement of pins could fully hide it. She had heard every name London had given her: the Greystone monster, her father's shame, the ugliest daughter in England. She walked toward the altar without a veil, because lace against her skin burned like nettles, and because she had decided, quietly, on this one morning of her life, that she would not hide. At the altar stood a man the newspapers had already begun to pity. Sebastian Shaw, newly inherited Duke of Silveroak, tall, composed, his jaw set in the calm of someone who had made his peace with a decision before the doubts could catch him. He did not flinch when she came into view. He did not smile falsely, and he did not look away in disgust. He simply watched her walk toward him, the way a sailor watches a storm he has already decided to stand in. The whispers followed her up the aisle like smoke. He must have been paid a kingdom. No amount of lace could make a duchess out of that. Someone laughed, thin and cruel, behind a fan. Sebastian heard every word. His face did not change. When Adelaide reached him, he stepped forward before the clergyman gave the signal, and offered her his arm in front of everyone. It was such a small thing. It was the first act of loyalty either of them had ever received in that church, and neither of them yet understood what it would cost, or what it would save. Adelaide studied his face as the vows began, searching for the thing she always searched for now, the flicker of disgust hiding behind good manners. She found none. She also found no warmth, no love, nothing but a terrible, steady calm. And calm from a man who was marrying her only for money was almost more frightening than cruelty. Cruelty she understood. Calm hid things. When the register was signed, her father, Nathaniel Harrington, Duke of Greystone, placed his hand upon her shoulder in a gesture that looked, to the 200 guests watching, like paternal affection. Adelaide flinched so hard the pen nearly tore the page. Sebastian saw it. He said nothing, but he did not forget it, and later that night, in a bedroom at Highmere Hall, with blood soaking through the back of his new wife's wedding gown, he would understand that the true horror of this marriage had nothing to do with the face society had mocked for years. It had everything to do with what her own father had done to her before he ever handed her away. Before we continue, dear friend, welcome to the fireside. If stories of duchesses wronged, dukes redeemed, and love that survives scandal and cruelty are the kind of tales that keep you watching until the very last candle burns out, then you are exactly where you belong. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, and tell us in the comments which city or country you are watching from tonight. We read every single one, and it means more to us than you know. Now settle in, because what Sebastian Shaw finds beneath his bride's wedding gown tonight will change everything you think you know about this marriage, and about the woman everyone called ugly. 3 weeks before the wedding, Sebastian Shaw had stood in the ruin of his own inheritance and tried to remember what it felt like to have choices. Silveroak Hall had once been a fine house, the kind travelers spoke of when they passed within sight of its towers. Now half its roof let in rain, its tenant farms were mortgaged past redemption, and its name had been dragged through every newspaper in England since his father, William Shaw, had been accused of selling government correspondence to a foreign power. The scandal had frozen the family's accounts, driven away every friend who valued reputation over loyalty, and left Sebastian, at 31, responsible for a widowed mother who no longer left her rooms, and a younger sister, Clara, whose prospects for marriage had shrunk to nothing. He had inherited a title and a mountain of debt in the same week, and he had learned very quickly that a duke without money is simply a beggar with a better coat. So when Nathaniel Harrington's card arrived requesting a private audience, Sebastian had gone, because pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Nathaniel received him in a study lined with ledgers and old portraits. A tall, silver-haired man whose voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who had spent a lifetime getting exactly what he wanted from other people. "I understand your family's difficulties," Nathaniel said, without preamble. "I understand them rather better than you might expect. Your father's case, for instance. Certain evidence was never made public. I have some small influence over whether it ever is." Sebastian kept his voice level. "You did not summon me to discuss my father's case, Your Grace." "No," Nathaniel smiled. "I summoned you to discuss my daughter." He said it as though he were offering Sebastian a horse. "My eldest, Adelaide, requires a husband. I am prepared, in exchange, to use my influence to reopen the inquiry into your father's disgrace, to release the entail on Silveroak's frozen accounts, to settle your creditors in full, and to see your sister Clara properly established in society. All of this, Sebastian, for a single ceremony and your name attached to hers." Sebastian had heard the rumors about Lady Adelaide Harrington the way every man in London had heard them. Cruel, exaggerated, repeated at dinner tables as entertainment. He asked to meet her before he answered, because whatever else he was not a man who would marry a stranger sight unseen and then flinch at her in public like a coward. Nathaniel arranged it grudgingly. Adelaide received him in the west drawing room at Greystone Court, standing rather than sitting, as if sitting might feel too much like an invitation to be looked at. He saw her clearly, the birthmark, the thinning hair at her temples, the height and breadth of her that no fashionable gown could soften. He saw, too, the way her chin lifted very slightly, bracing for whatever expression was about to cross his face. "You may look your fill, Your Grace," she said, before he could speak. "I am told it is customary before purchase. I am not here to purchase anything, Lady Adelaide. No, only to marry it." Her voice was dry, controlled, entirely without self-pity. "My father tells me you are desperate. I am told I am hideous. It seems a fair trade for both of us to pretend otherwise for the length of a ceremony." Sebastian found, unexpectedly, that he did not want to lie to her. "I will not pretend I am marrying you for affection. I would be a fool to insult you with that lie. But I will not insult you with false horror either. You are not what the newspapers describe. What am I then? Someone I have not yet had the chance to know." It was not romantic. It was not even especially kind. But it was honest, and Adelaide had received so little honesty in her life that it struck her harder than any compliment could have. She accepted the marriage for her own reasons, reasons she told no one, not even Sebastian. Her father had promised that once she married, she would finally be permitted to leave Greystone Court and live independently at Highmere Hall, the estate her mother had left her. 12 years of confinement had taught Adelaide to want nothing so much as a door she could close behind herself, and know it would not be locked from the outside. What she did not know, what neither of them yet knew, was the shape of the trap closing around them both. Adelaide's mother, Lady Eleanor Harrington, had died 12 years before, falling from the gallery at Greystone Court, in what the coroner ruled a tragic accident. Adelaide had never believed that ruling for a single day of her life. Eleanor had left behind, through her own father, an enormous fortune, entirely separate from the Harrington dukedom. Railway shares, mining interests, government bonds, and Highmere Hall itself, all held in trust because Eleanor's father had never trusted his son-in-law with a single shilling more than the law required. Under that trust, Adelaide would gain full control of everything the moment she married, or on her 30th birthday, whichever came first. Nathaniel had been trustee of that fortune throughout her minority. He had also, over 12 careful years, spent a significant portion of it on political favors, on failed investments, on debts he could never admit to. Once Adelaide married, the fraud would be impossible to hide. With his solicitor, Ambrose Holloway, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, Nathaniel had built something far darker than a simple marriage of convenience. Adelaide would marry. Enough money would be released to make the union appear legitimate. Within months, she would die under circumstances designed to look tragic. Sebastian, ruined, desperate, married to a wealthy woman who died suddenly, would make a perfect suspect. A forged clause buried in the marriage settlement would return her fortune to Harrington control the instant Sebastian was convicted of causing her death. He had chosen Sebastian precisely because the Shaw name was already disgraced. No one would grieve too loudly for a duke everyone already believed was capable of anything. In the days before the wedding, Adelaide had allowed herself, once or twice, to imagine what Highmere Hall might feel like as a true home, rather than a destination. She pictured mornings without her father's footsteps in the corridor outside her door. Evenings without a physician arriving unbidden to ask pointed questions about her nerves. She did not picture love. She had trained herself out of that particular hope years ago, the way one trains a limb to stop reaching for something long since amputated. She pictured only quiet, and she told herself that quiet would be enough. Sebastian, for his part, had spent those same days in a kind of grim arithmetic, weighing his mother's failing health against his own pride, his sister's shrinking prospects against the discomfort of marrying a stranger. The whole of London found it fashionable to mock. He was not a cruel man, and he took no pleasure in imagining Adelaide's isolation, but he had told himself, in the privacy of his own mind, that this marriage would be a transaction conducted with courtesy, nothing more, and that courtesy alone would be enough to make it bearable for them both. Neither of them yet understood how thoroughly they had underestimated each other, nor how completely Nathaniel Harrington intended to use that underestimation against them. Neither Sebastian nor Adelaide understood, on the morning of their wedding, that they had each been selected as pieces in a game, designed to end with one of them buried and the other hanged. The night before her wedding, Adelaide Harrington did something that would have ended in her death, had anyone discovered it in time. She had spent years learning the rhythms of Greystone Court, which floorboards announced footsteps, which servants reported directly to her father, which hours the West Wing stood empty, while Ambrose Holloway took his evening brandy in the library. Her mother's old writing cabinet sat locked inside that same West Wing library, untouched for 12 years, and Adelaide had never been able to find the key. She found it 3 days before her wedding, hidden inside a false-bottom jewelry case that had belonged to her mother, wrapped in a scrap of blue silk, as though Eleanor had known someone would need it one day. Adelaide did not open the cabinet. There was no time, and she dared not risk the sound. Instead, she did the only thing she could think to do. She sewed the small iron key into the inner lining of the bodice she would wear beneath her wedding gown, stitching it in place with trembling fingers by candlelight, telling herself that whatever waited inside that cabinet, she would find a way to reach it once she was mistress of her own house. Someone had been watching her more closely than she knew. The night before the wedding, 2 of her father's men came to her rooms without warning. They did not strike her. Nathaniel was too careful for anything so crude that it might leave a mark visible at the altar, but they gripped her arms hard enough to bruise, demanding to know what she had taken from the West Wing, searching her rooms, her trunks, her jewelry boxes, everything but the gown itself, which hung untouched in her dressing closet, because no one imagined a bride would hide anything inside her own wedding dress. Adelaide told them nothing. She had learned, over 12 years, exactly how much pain she could absorb without breaking, and she absorbed it that night, the way she had absorbed everything else. in silence, behind a locked door, alone. By morning, the bruises on her upper arms were hidden beneath long sleeves and gloves. The cut where the key's edge had pressed too hard against her ribs during the struggle was hidden beneath layers of silk and stays. She walked down the aisle of St. Cecilia's church with her mother's secret sewn against her heart, and her father's cruelty sewn against her ribs, and no one in that packed church, admiring or mocking her, had any notion of what she carried beneath the ivory, she thought, as the church bells rang out behind her, and the carriage pulled away from St. Cecilia's, of her mother's hands, warm and quick, teaching her as a girl how to hold a needle steady even when her fingers trembled. She had not sewn anything since Eleanor's death. She had chosen, deliberately, to sew this, a single act of quiet defiance, stitched into the very garment her father had insisted she wear, to be paraded before all of London, as though even her wedding gown might be made to serve her, rather than simply display her. The carriage ride to Highmere Hall passed in near silence. Sebastian, who had spent the ceremony reading every flinch and hesitation in his new wife's posture, understood by now that something was deeply wrong, though he could not yet name it. Adelaide sat with her spine perfectly straight, her hands folded over her bouquet long after there was any need to hold it, her breathing careful and shallow, in a way that had nothing to do with the tightness of her gown. "You need not perform composure for my benefit, Your Grace," he said quietly, using her new style for the first time. "I have already seen you as you are. There is no audience left to convince." "There is always an audience," Adelaide said, "even when it is only you." He did not press her further. He had learned enough, in one short conversation weeks before, to understand that pressing Adelaide only closed doors that patience might eventually open. At Highmere Hall, the staff had prepared the traditional wedding night arrangements. A lady's maid, to assist the new Duchess in undressing, warmed water, a fire built high against the autumn chill. Adelaide dismissed the maid at the bedchamber door with a firmness that startled the girl. "I will manage alone," she said. Sebastian, standing in the corridor outside, heard the maid's soft protest and Adelaide's sharper refusal, and something in his chest tightened that he could not yet explain. He waited nearly an hour, giving her the privacy she seemed so desperate to have, before he noticed the maid returning down the corridor, pale and frightened, whispering to another servant that there was blood on my lady's gown. My lady would not let me help her. My lady would not let me touch the back of it at all. Sebastian did not hesitate. He knocked at her door and did not open it. "Adelaide, there is blood on your gown. I am not asking to enter uninvited. I am asking whether you require a physician." Silence stretched long enough that he nearly knocked again. Then her voice came, quieter than he had yet heard it. "Not a physician, please. Not him." "Then may I come in?" Another silence. Then the sound of a bolt drawing back. What Sebastian saw when he stepped into that room would remain with him for the rest of his life. Adelaide stood half-turned from the door, one arm braced against the bedpost, her wedding gown loosened at the back, where she had struggled to reach the last of her own laces. Sebastian saw the blood first, a dark stain spreading across pale silk, just beneath her shoulder blade, fresh enough that it had not yet dried. Then he saw what the blood surrounded. Old scars, silvered with age, encircled both her wrists, the unmistakable mark of restraints worn for long stretches of time. Narrower scars ringed her ankles. Across her shoulders ran faded lines, where leather straps had once held her flat against a bed, the kind of marks left by so-called medical treatments, administered against a patient's will. And layered over all of it, fresh and violent against her pale skin, finger-shaped bruises darkened her upper arms, and beneath her shoulder blade, a shallow cut wept blood, where something small and hard had been pressed too forcefully into her flesh. He had learned enough in the last hour to know that the worst thing he could do to this woman was crowd her. "May I come nearer?" he asked. "I will not touch you until you say I may." Adelaide's eyes, when they met his, held none of the composure she had worn since the church. What he saw there instead was raw, unguarded terror. The look of someone who had rarely been touched without permission, waiting to learn whether her husband would be one more person who took that choice from her. "You may look," she whispered. "I find I no longer have the strength to hide it." He crossed the room slowly and knelt beside her rather than looming over her, bringing his eyes level with hers rather than above them. "Who did this?" "My father's men, last night." Her voice shook, though her chin remained lifted from long habit. "They searched my rooms. They believed I had taken something from the West Wing." Her free hand moved instinctively toward the fresh cut beneath her shoulder. "I had. I sewed it into the lining of this gown before they could find it." Sebastian's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed gentle. "What did you take?" "A key." She said it as though confessing a crime, rather than describing an act of desperate survival. "It opens my mother's writing cabinet. She died 12 years ago. I have always believed my father had a hand in it, and I have never been able to prove anything, because he has kept me confined and discredited for exactly as long as it might have taken me to try." Sebastian thought of his own father, disgraced and ruined by scandal, and a cold recognition settled over him. He understood, better than most men in that room would ever be forced to, how easily the powerful could destroy those beneath them and call it misfortune. "Let me see to the cut," he said. "I will not send for the house physician if you do not wish it." "He is my father's man," Adelaide said. "He signed the papers that let them strap me to a bed for weeks at a time, and called it treatment for nervous instability. I have not trusted a physician in 10 years, and I will not begin tonight. Then I will tend it myself, if you permit it, and we will send for someone independent in the morning." She studied him for a long moment, searching, as she always did, for the flicker of disgust or pity that would tell her this was all performance. She found instead something steadier, a man kneeling on the floor of her bedchamber, asking permission for every small thing, refusing to take from her the one power she had left, which was the power to say yes or no to her own body. "Yes," she said finally, "you may." He fetched clean water and linen himself, rather than ringing for a servant who might carry tales back to Greystone Court by morning. He worked with careful, unhurried hands, and though the room held nothing but candlelight and the quiet business of tending a wound, it was, without either of them intending it, the most intimate moment either had ever shared with another person. Adelaide watched him work and found herself, absurdly, thinking not of the pain in her shoulder, but of how strange it was to be touched so carefully by a stranger she had married only that morning. How strange it was that gentleness, of all things, should be the sensation that finally broke through 12 years of careful armor. "You are very quiet," Sebastian said, without looking up from the bandage. "I am considering how many ways I expected this evening to go, and how none of them resembled this. Was I meant to be crueler?" "You were meant to be gone by now," Adelaide admitted. "Most men would have left the moment they saw the scars, and called for an annulment before morning." "Then it is fortunate," Sebastian said quietly, "that I have never much cared what most men would do." When it was done, Sebastian sat back on his heels and looked at her, at the scars, the bruises, the birthmark, the thinning hair, all of it lit gold by the fire, and said the only thing that felt true: "I knew what you looked like when I married you, Adelaide. I did not know that someone had tried to break you before placing you in my hands. I intend to find out who and why, and I intend for it to stop." Adelaide, who had braced herself for pity and received instead a promise, felt some old, guarded wall inside her give way, quietly, without her permission, in a manner she did not yet have a name for. The key, still stained with her own blood where it had cut through skin and silk, lay on the table beside them. Neither of them yet knew that it would take them into a conspiracy that reached from a locked cabinet in a forgotten wing of Greystone Court, all the way to the framing of Sebastian's own father, and the murder of Adelaide's mother, 12 years before. Outside the bedchamber window, A single lamp burned in the gatehouse long after it should have been dark. A signal, though neither Sebastian nor Adelaide yet understood it, that Nathaniel Harrington already knew his daughter had taken something from the West Wing, and that his patience for waiting was almost at its end. Adelaide had believed, for most of her adult life, that Highmere Hall would be the one place her father's reach could not follow. Her mother had left it to her outright, unentailed, meant as a private inheritance rather than a piece of the Harrington estate. She had imagined, in her darkest hours at Greystone Court, a house with doors she could lock from the inside, rather than doors locked against her from without. Within a week of the wedding, she understood how wrong she had been. Sebastian noticed it first, the way certain servants deferred not to their new mistress, but to instructions that seemed to arrive from elsewhere. The house physician, a Dr. Augustus Vaughan, arrived unannounced on the fourth day, claiming concern for the new Duchess's nerves, and Sebastian turned him away at the door with a coldness that surprised even himself. "My wife does not require a physician chosen by her father," he told the man plainly. "If she requires one at all, I will choose him myself." Adelaide, watching from the top of the stairs, felt an unfamiliar warmth move through her as she watched her husband defend a boundary she had spent 12 long years defending entirely on her own. Over the following days, a fragile domestic peace began to take shape between them, built less from romance than from necessity, though the necessity had a way of creating its own kind of closeness. They began taking breakfast together, tentatively at first, then with less hesitation. Sebastian discovered, to his genuine surprise, that his wife understood estate management better than most stewards he had employed. She corrected an error in the Highmere accounts within her first week that had cost the tenants money for years, and she reviewed petitions from the tenant farmers with an attention to detail that put his own education to shame. "You were raised to manage an estate," he said one morning, watching her mark corrections in the ledger with a steady hand. "I was raised to be useful to no one but my father," Adelaide corrected, not looking up. "The rest I taught myself, in the hours he believed I was resting." Sebastian found himself, against every intention of remaining courteous but distant, beginning to admire her. Not despite the things society mocked her for, but entirely separate from them, in a way that had nothing to do with her face, and everything to do with the sharpness of her mind, and the quiet steel beneath her caution. There were smaller moments too, moments that built themselves into something neither of them named aloud. Adelaide avoided one particular chair in the drawing room, a delicate gilded thing she feared her weight might break, and said nothing of it. Sebastian noticed anyway. Within days, a sturdier upholstered chair appeared beside the drawing room fire, offered without comment, without the humiliation of acknowledgement, simply there for her comfort the next time she needed to sit. When a fashionable London dressmaker arrived to fit Adelaide for new gowns, and began speaking about her figure as though she were not present in the room, suggesting heavy fabrics to disguise her shape, Sebastian dismissed the woman before Adelaide had to say a word. Adelaide, furious at being handled rather than asked, told him plainly that she had not requested rescue. Sebastian, to his credit, apologized without excuse, and let her choose her own seamstress after, a local woman named Elsie, sister to Adelaide's maid Mabel, who fitted her gowns to the body she actually had, rather than the one society wished she possessed. There were lighter moments too, moments neither of them expected to find inside a marriage built on desperation. One wet afternoon, with the rain too heavy for anyone to think of riding out, Sebastian led Adelaide to the long gallery at Highmere, and declared, with the gravity of a man announcing a battle plan, that she would learn to dance. "I have never danced in public in my life," Adelaide told him, arms folded. "I do not intend to begin in an empty gallery, with no orchestra, and one reluctant duke for an audience. The orchestra will arrive eventually. Until then, you will have to make do with my humming, which I promise you, is worse than any string quartet in London." She stepped on his foot within the first minute, hard enough that he winced. "My foot," Sebastian said, with great solemnity, "has now received more attention from you than I have since our wedding day." "It has shown greater courage," Adelaide answered, and to her own surprise, laughed. A real laugh, startled out of her, the kind she had not allowed herself in years. Sebastian went still at the sound of it, and did not manage to hide how completely it undid him. And from that afternoon forward, he found himself listening for it the way other men listened for church bells. Clara Shaw arrived at Highmere not long after, having finally been permitted to visit her brother's new household, and brought with her an energy the house badly needed. She was young, unguarded, and utterly unable to keep an opinion to herself, and she attached herself to Adelaide within a day, with the fierce loyalty of a girl who had spent years watching her own family be mocked, and had decided she would rather laugh at cruelty than be crushed by it. When a visiting countess remarked, just within earshot, that she wondered what such a large woman found to wear that actually fit her, Adelaide answered without even glancing up from her tea, "You need not trouble yourself over my wardrobe, Lady Fitzpatrick. It has survived far more determined attacks than your vocabulary." Clara, delighted, leaned toward her. Was that an insult? Only if she is clever enough to understand it. Clara considered this with great seriousness. "Then I fear you have wasted it." Even Charles Goodwin, the elderly butler who had served the Highmere household long before Adelaide's arrival, proved a quiet source of dry comfort. When Sebastian asked him plainly whether anyone entered the locked west corridor without leave, Goodwin answered without blinking, "No respectable member of the household, Your Grace." He then looked, meaningfully, at the key resting on his own tray. "And the less respectable members?" Sebastian asked. "They tend to be more useful," Goodwin said, and said nothing further, though Sebastian understood perfectly well that the old man had been quietly protecting Adelaide's secrets since long before her husband ever arrived to help carry them. Not every moment was so gentle. At a small formal dinner meant to begin easing Adelaide back into society as the new Duchess of Silveroak, one of her long gloves split along an old seam, exposing the marked skin of her hand in front of a table full of guests who had come, in no small part, to see exactly that. A ripple of stares moved down the table. Adelaide felt her spine lock, the old instinct to disappear rising in her throat before she could swallow it back down. Sebastian, without a word, removed his own gloves and set them beside his plate, and continued the conversation exactly where it had left off, as though nothing at all had occurred. He made no announcement of solidarity. He simply erased, in one quiet motion, the difference between his own bare hands and hers, until no one at that table could stare at her exposed skin without also staring at his. It was a small thing. Adelaide would remember it for the rest of her life. There was one shadow across those otherwise warming weeks. A family friend of the Harringtons, a clever, well-connected gentleman named Dorian Sterling, took a genuine interest in Adelaide's political opinions during a visit to London, seeking her company at length over matters of trade and reform that most gentlemen would never have thought to discuss with a duchess at all. Sebastian, watching them from across a crowded drawing room, felt a jealousy he did not enjoy admitting to. "You appeared displeased this evening," Clara told him afterward, far too observant for her own good. "I was considering the weather," Sebastian said. "The weather is not holding my sister-in-law's hand in conversation for the better part of an hour." When Adelaide confronted him directly about his coldness, she did not offer comfort. "You entered this marriage for an estate, Sebastian. You cannot now behave as though my conversation belongs exclusively to you." Sebastian, to his credit, did not argue the point. "I admit the jealousy freely. I do not claim it gives me any right to your company beyond what you choose to offer it." It was a small exchange, but it marked another quiet turning point. Proof that whatever this marriage was becoming, it would not become another cage with a kinder jailer. It was into this fragile, careful peace that disaster arrived. Mabel Goodwin, Adelaide's lady's maid, and the butler Charles Goodwin's own daughter, had taken to tasting her mistress's evening chocolate before serving it, a habit born of old suspicion, rather than any specific fear. One evening, she drank from a cup meant for Adelaide, and collapsed within the hour, her breathing shallow, her skin cold to the touch. Sebastian did not wait for the household physician. He rode himself, in the middle of the night, to fetch an independent doctor from the neighboring town, a man with no ties to Greystone Court, or to Nathaniel Harrington's influence. Mabel survived, though it took 2 days before the fever broke and her breathing steadied. Adelaide sat beside the girl's bed through both of those days, her hands never still, guilt and fury moving through her in equal measure. "It was meant for me," she said quietly. On the second night, when Sebastian brought her tea, she did not touch. "Someone in this house is still reporting to my father." This was never a refuge. It was only ever another cage with better furniture. "Then we stop waiting for your father's permission to be safe," Sebastian said, and something in his voice had changed entirely from the calm, careful courtesy of their wedding day. "We stop waiting, and we begin fighting back." That night, with Mabel finally sleeping peacefully, and the house quiet around them, Adelaide led Sebastian to the West Wing library of Highmere Hall. Eleanor's writing cabinet stood there now, moved from Greystone Court in the days directly following the wedding, exactly as her mother's will had long instructed. Nathaniel had been unable to refuse the transfer without raising a suspicion he could not afford, though he had clearly hoped Adelaide would never think to ask after it, before her death made the question irrelevant. The cabinet had sat untouched in its new home for barely a week, waiting for a key no one but Adelaide possessed. The key, healed now into the story of Adelaide's own skin, turned in the lock with a small, final click. Inside lay a ledger written in a private code, dozens of letters, and a portrait of Eleanor Harrington that Adelaide had not seen since she was 15 years old. The coded ledger took weeks to understand, and it was Adelaide, not Sebastian, who broke through it first. She remembered, from childhood, helping her mother organize the household accounts on quiet afternoons, remembered Eleanor's habit of disguising real figures inside ordinary domestic entries, a payment for candles that was really a bribe, a laundry expense that concealed an illegal withdrawal from Adelaide's own trust. Adelaide had thought those memories useless for 12 years. Now they became the key to everything. Line by line, across evenings that stretched long past midnight, Adelaide and Sebastian pieced together what Eleanor Harrington had uncovered before she died. That Nathaniel had been systematically stealing from Adelaide's maternal inheritance for years, funding failed investments and political favors he could never openly account for, and that he could not permit an independent audit of that fortune once Adelaide's marriage handed her legal control of it. Then Sebastian found a name in the ledger that made his blood run cold. Payments, dated only months before his father's public disgrace, made to a newspaper editor and to a minor official in the Foreign Office. Payments that traced, unmistakably, back to Nathaniel Harrington. "My father was framed," Sebastian said, his voice flat with a fury he was struggling to contain. "Your father destroyed my family to eliminate a witness." Adelaide, exhausted and raw from her own discoveries, misread his anger as accusation. "Do you believe I knew this? That I married you knowing my father had ruined yours? I did not say that. You did not need to. I see it in your face." Mabel Goodwin, recovering slowly in her own quarters, complained loudly that nearly dying had made the entire household unbearably protective of her. When Adelaide told her gently to rest and stop arguing about it, Mabel answered with the bluntness Adelaide had come to treasure in her. "With respect, my lady, you married a duke and uncovered a conspiracy within a fortnight. I shall not accept lectures on sensible conduct from you of all people." It was exactly the kind of laughter the house needed after such a frightening week, and Adelaide found herself smiling despite everything, grateful for a maid who refused to let fear have the final word. Not every discovery in that unused library came without cost of its own. While searching the shelves for anything else Eleanor might have hidden, Adelaide stepped through an old servant's door that swung shut behind her, its lock turning with a small, ordinary click that meant nothing to anyone else in the house, and meant everything to her. The sound sent her back 12 years in an instant, back to a locked room at Greystone Court, back to leather straps and Dr. Vaughan's calm voice, telling her the confinement was for her own good. Her breath came fast and shallow. Her hands found no purchase on a door that would not open. She was 15 again, and fully grown, both at once, and neither version of herself could make the panic stop. Sebastian broke the lock within moments of hearing her cry out, but he did not rush toward her the way instinct told him to. He knelt several feet away instead, keeping the doorway open and visible behind him, and spoke in a low, steady voice. "You are in the library at Highmere, Adelaide. The door is open behind me. No one will touch you unless you ask it of them. I am not moving until you tell me to." He stayed there, patient and still, for what felt to both of them like a very long time, until at last, Adelaide crossed the distance herself and took his hand, choosing the contact rather than having it forced upon her. Sebastian did not pull her into an embrace. He simply held her hand and let her set the pace of everything that came after. And it became, without either of them planning it, one of the most intimate moments they had yet shared. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire in the grate had burned low, and the ledger lay open between them on the small writing table, its coded columns finally beginning to yield their secrets after weeks of careful, patient work. Adelaide had grown almost fond of the ledger's cramped, careful handwriting, had come to recognize in it the particular slant her mother used when she was writing quickly, urgently, afraid of being discovered. She had not expected to find her husband's family name buried inside her mother's fear. Their first real quarrel as husband and wife erupted that night, born not of cruelty but of two wounded people mistaking each other's pain for blame. Adelaide reminded him, sharply, that she had been a confined child of 15 when William Shaw's disgrace occurred, powerless to stop anything, powerless even to leave her own rooms. Sebastian, hearing the truth of it land, felt shame replace his anger almost at once. "I am sorry," he said, without qualification, without excuse. "I let my own grief speak for me. You are not your father, Adelaide, any more than my father's mistakes belong to me." It was the first time either of them had apologized to the other without expecting something in return, and it changed the shape of the marriage more than either of them yet understood. They learned in the weeks that followed that Eleanor had gathered her evidence with the help of a young cousin, Violet Prescott, who had vanished from society 3 years earlier, under circumstances no one had ever explained. Adelaide had always believed Violet abandoned her out of shame. The truth, when it finally reached them by careful, secret correspondence, was crueler and more forgivable. Nathaniel had threatened to prosecute Violet's brother for a theft he never committed unless she left England quietly. Violet had spent 3 years hiding in Scotland, carrying with her a single page of Eleanor's coded evidence, too frightened to return and too loyal to destroy it. "I thought everyone eventually chose safety over me," Adelaide admitted to Sebastian the night Violet's letter arrived. "I have believed that since I was 15 years old." "Not everyone," Sebastian said quietly. "Not any longer." Nathaniel, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, did not wait to see how far his daughter's investigation would reach. He arranged for a private threat to be delivered to Sebastian directly. Restore the ledger to Harrington hands. Permit Adelaide to be quietly committed to a private asylum for the sake of appearances. And in exchange, Clara Shaw's name, recently and falsely linked in the newspapers to the forged evidence against their father, would be cleared entirely. Sebastian refused the bargain in writing, before witnesses, though it cost him a night of the deepest fear he had known since his father's disgrace first broke over his family. Adelaide would not learn of that refusal until much later, and when she did, it would mean more to her than any declaration of love spoken directly to her face. Ambrose Holloway had served Nathaniel Harrington for over 20 years, forging documents, drafting fraudulent settlements, arranging the medical confinements that had stolen 12 years from Adelaide's life. He had also, quietly and patiently, kept copies of every crime he committed on his employer's behalf, waiting for the day Nathaniel's usefulness to him would end. That day arrived the moment he learned Eleanor's ledger had surfaced. Ambrose could not risk the evidence reaching a court of law before he had secured his own escape, and so he did what desperate men in failing conspiracies have always done. He arranged for a fire. It began in the unused library at Highmere Hall, in the very room where Eleanor's cabinet had stood untouched for a week, before Adelaide found the key to open it, and it spread with a speed that suggested more than accident. Adelaide, hearing the alarm raised, did not think of her own safety first. She thought of the ledger, still resting in a drawer in that burning room, the only proof that could clear Sebastian's father and expose her own. She went in through the old servant's passage she had memorized as a child, visiting Highmere with her mother before Eleanor's death, and found the drawer through smoke, thick enough to sting tears from her eyes. She had just closed her hand around the ledger when part of the ceiling gave way behind her, and Sebastian, who had followed her the moment he realized she was missing, reached her through the collapsing timber with a beam falling hard across his shoulder. It was Adelaide, not Sebastian, who found the hidden exit, remembered from a childhood visit 12 years gone. It was Adelaide who braced his injured shoulder against her own, who forced open a warped door swollen shut by years of damp, who half-carried her husband out into the cold night air, with the ledger still pressed beneath her cloak against her heart. They did not stop until they reached the old chapel at the edge of the estate, long abandoned, its windows broken, its altar bare, moonlight falling in pale slats across a floor no congregation had knelt upon in a generation. The smell of smoke still clung to both their clothes. Sebastian's shoulder throbbed where the falling beam had struck it, and Adelaide's hands, when she finally looked down at them, were shaking with an aftershock she had been too occupied to notice until the danger had passed. It was in that small, ruined sanctuary, soot-streaked and trembling with the aftermath of near disaster, that Sebastian finally told her everything he had been too proud and too cautious to say. "I married you to save Silveroak," he said. "I believed a restored house could rebuild everything my father's disgrace had taken from us. I intended to be courteous and distant, and to call it duty, because duty asks nothing of the heart. And now," Adelaide asked, her voice barely above the crackle of the dying fire behind them, "now I understand that a house built on your ruin would have finished destroying us both. I do not want Silveroak at the cost of you, Adelaide. I have not wanted that for weeks, if I am honest with myself, and I have been a coward for not saying so sooner." He did not tell her she was beautiful, as though correcting some mistake society had made about her. He told her, instead, exactly what he had come to want: her unsparing honesty, the strength in her hands that had just saved his life, the sound of her laughter that he had heard only once and had been chasing ever since, the particular way she held her chin when she refused to be ashamed of anything. "I search for your face now whenever you leave a room," he admitted. "I did not marry you for this, but I find I do not wish to imagine a house that does not have you in it." Adelaide, who had spent so many years being treated as a burden or a joke, felt something long guarded finally loosen its hold on her. Their first kiss was slow and careful, and entirely their own choice, born of nothing but two people who had chosen each other, in the middle of a burning night, with no father's bargain left to explain it. In the weeks that followed, their intimacy deepened beyond that single moment, always slow, always gentle, always led by Adelaide's own choice, rather than any assumption Sebastian made about what marriage entitled him to. He let her keep the candlelight burning, or extinguish it as she wished. He let her set the pace of every step between them, and in that patient, quiet trust, Adelaide finally allowed herself to want him back without fear, without bracing for rejection, without waiting for the moment his desire would curdle into disgust, the way every man before him had promised it would. if any man before him had bothered to promise her anything at all. Nathaniel, informed by Ambrose that his daughter and her husband had survived the fire with the ledger intact, understood at last that his careful plan had failed beyond repair. He made one final offer to Sebastian: the complete restoration of Silveroak Hall, every debt cleared, a government appointment, Clara's name fully cleared, and a quiet annulment to end the marriage without scandal, on the single condition that Sebastian sign a statement declaring his wife unstable of mind. Sebastian refused in writing, before witnesses, exactly as he had refused the first time, giving up the very reward that had once brought him to the altar. Adelaide, standing just outside the study door, heard every word of that refusal, and Sebastian did not know she had been listening at all. The formal inquiry convened at Belgrave House on a grey autumn morning, attended by trustees, magistrates, journalists, and members of both the Harrington and Shaw families, called ostensibly to settle a dispute over trust management, but understood by everyone present to be something far larger. Nathaniel had expected a quiet, private settlement, conducted among gentlemen behind closed doors. He had not expected his daughter to arrive on her husband's arm, wearing a deep green gown fitted honestly to the body she actually possessed, without a veil, without a high collar to hide her throat, her hair arranged simply, without any attempt to disguise the thinning at her temples. It was not a cosmetic transformation. It was the visible end of 12 years spent apologizing for existing. Whispers moved through Belgrave House the moment she entered, the same kind of whispers that had once followed her up the aisle of St. Cecilia's church. This time, Adelaide did not lower her eyes. She had spent a lifetime being watched without her consent, mocked for a face and a body she had never asked for and could not change. She had decided, somewhere between the fire and this cold autumn morning, that she would rather be watched while telling the truth than hidden while carrying someone else's shame. Nathaniel had chosen the venue carefully, expecting the familiar faces of Belgrave House to side with old loyalty over new scandal. He had underestimated how quickly loyalty curdles once a room full of powerful men begin to suspect that the accused might, after all this time, be one of their own crimes waiting to surface. Adelaide understood this instinctively, in a way her father never had. She did not need every gentleman present to love her. She only needed enough of them to fear being caught defending a liar. Nathaniel attempted, in front of the assembled inquiry, to paint his daughter as unstable, dependent on delusion, unfit to manage the fortune she was fighting to claim. Adelaide answered every accusation not with tears or defense, but with evidence, laid out with the same careful precision she had once used to correct Hymea's tenant ledgers. She presented Dr. Vaughan's falsified medical reports, proof of years of confinement built on manufactured diagnoses. She presented the bank transfers showing systematic theft from her own trust. She presented Ambrose Holloway's forged settlement clause, the one meant to hand her fortune back to Harrington control, the moment Sebastian was convicted of a murder that had never yet occurred. She presented Violet Prescott's decoded page, and Eleanor's final letter, preserved for 12 frightened years by Nathaniel's own sister, Lady Beatrice Harrington, who came forward at last with the courage she had lacked for over a decade. She presented William Shaw's correspondence, proving her father had destroyed an innocent man to silence a witness to his theft. She presented Mabel's own testimony about the poisoned cup that had nearly cost an innocent servant her life. Ambrose Holloway, seeing the case collapsing around his employer, attempted to shift every crime onto Nathaniel entirely, only for Adelaide to reveal, with quiet and devastating precision, that Ambrose had kept private copies of his own forgeries for years, intending all along to blackmail whoever eventually inherited Greystone. Nathaniel, cornered at last by evidence he could no longer discredit, lost the composure that had served him his entire life. Had Eleanor surrendered the papers when she was warned, he said, his voice rising for the first time anyone in that room had ever heard it rise. None of this would have occurred. The room went silent at the admission, buried inside his own fury. Pressed further by the magistrates, Nathaniel revealed, in a moment of broken pride he would spend the rest of his life regretting, that he had watched Eleanor fall from that gallery 12 years before, impaired by a sedative Ambrose had substituted for her heart medicine, and had chosen not to call for help. Sebastian did not speak over his wife throughout the entire proceeding. He intervened only once, when Nathaniel's men attempted to physically remove Adelaide from the room, stepping between them with a quiet authority that needed no raised voice. He submitted his own signed refusal of Nathaniel's final bargain as evidence, proof that he had given up an entire fortune rather than betray the woman standing beside him. "My wife," he told the inquiry, when at last he was asked to speak, "and my equal in every part of this matter." The magistrates conferred only briefly before ordering both men held. Nathaniel Harrington, who had spent his entire life commanding rooms with nothing more than the calm certainty of his own authority, was led from Belgrave House in handcuffs, while the same aristocrats who had once courted his favor turned their faces away rather than meet his eyes. It was, Adelaide thought as she watched him go, a strange and hollow kind of victory. Not joy exactly, but the quiet satisfaction of a debt finally called in after 12 long years of waiting. Nathaniel Harrington and Ambrose Holloway were both arrested before the inquiry adjourned, held for trial on charges that would end, in the months that followed, with Nathaniel stripped of his influence and Ambrose sentenced for forgery and conspiracy. Dr. Augustus Vaughan lost his medical license and faced prosecution of his own for the false confinements he had authorized for profit. William Shaw's name was formally cleared of treason, though the inquiry acknowledged, with unflinching honesty, that he had delayed revealing Eleanor's evidence out of his own pride and political calculation. A flawed man, wronged nonetheless, and finally allowed to rest with his name restored rather than perfected. Adelaide received full and legal control of Highmere Hall and her mother's entire fortune. Silveroak Hall was restored not through Nathaniel's broken promises, but through the plain judgment of law, earned rather than purchased. In the quiet that followed the trial, Sebastian told Adelaide plainly that the circumstances under which she had married him had been coercive from the very beginning, and that he would understand and would not fight her if she wished an annulment or a legal separation, now that she was free to choose anything at all. "Do you want your freedom?" Adelaide asked him. "No," Sebastian said, "but your choice must matter more than what I want. It always should have." Adelaide chose him. They exchanged new vows privately at Highmere Hall in the spring that followed, with no father presiding, no newspapers watching, no money changing hands, and no family controlling a single term of the arrangement. Clara Shaw stood beside them, teasing her brother gently about finally learning to dance without ruining anyone's shoes, and Mabel Goodwin declared, with her usual blunt affection, that any duchess who could survive a fire, a poisoning, and her own father's trial in a single year had certainly earned one quiet wedding. Society, in the months that followed, did not become suddenly kind. Some still stared when Adelaide entered a room without hiding her face or her body. A few still whispered the old names behind gloved hands, believing distance made the cruelty invisible. The difference now was that she no longer treated their stares as a verdict on her worth. Within 2 years, Adelaide gave Sebastian an heir, a son, born with his father's steady calm, and, the family liked to say, his mother's unmistakable stubbornness, and named William after the grandfather he would grow up knowing only as a man, wrongly disgraced and rightly cleared. Adelaide also established a legal trust to assist women who had suffered fraudulent medical confinement as she had, funding solicitors and independent physicians for those who had no father's fortune and no duke's protection to fall back on. only her own hard-earned understanding of exactly what it cost to be believed. On the evening of her daughter's first birthday, Adelaide stood at the head of a long table at Highmere Hall, hosting a gathering of tenants, friends and family. Her face lit warm by candlelight, her hair simply arranged, her birthmark and her scars, and every part of her exactly as visible as they had always been. She thought sometimes, on quiet evenings like this one, of the girl she had been at 15, locked in a room at Greystone Court, and told that her body and her face made her unworthy of a life lived in the open. She thought of the years spent believing that love, if it ever came at all, would come only in exchange for silence, for smallness, for gratitude, that any man had troubled himself to look at her at all. She did not resent that girl. She simply no longer recognized her, and she was glad of it. There were still mornings when old habits surfaced without warning. A flinch at a raised hand that meant nothing. A reluctance to enter a room before checking that the door behind her remained unlocked. Sebastian never remarked on these moments when they came. He simply waited, steady as he had always been, until the fear passed and the woman she had become stood in its place again. Sebastian found her there at the head of the table, watching her watch the room, and settled his hand over hers, the way he had settled it every evening since the chapel, without demand, without performance, simply because it was where he wanted it to be. "You are thinking again," he said. "Always," Adelaide answered. "It is one of my worst qualities by all accounts." "It is, without question, my favorite thing about you," Sebastian said, and meant every word of it. She had been called the ugliest daughter in England. She had also, in the end, become the most unshakable duchess it had ever produced, and she no longer needed anyone's permission to know it. If Adelaide and Sebastian's story moved something in you tonight, then you already understand why we tell these tales, and why we are so glad to have you here with us. If you enjoyed this journey through scandal, cruelty, courage, and a love that was never bought but finally chosen, please like this video, subscribe if you have not already, and leave a comment telling us which moment struck you hardest. Was it the key in the gown, the fire in the library, or the vows spoken with no father watching? We read every single comment, and every one of them tells us these stories are worth continuing to tell. We have another duke, another scandal, and another woman the world underestimated waiting for you very soon. So make sure you are subscribed and ready when she arrives. Until then, thank you for spending this hour with us, and for believing, as we do, that the ones the world calls ugly or broken or unworthy are so often the ones who turn out to be the strongest in the room. Good night, dear friend, and we will see you at the next fireside.